about the sources of law? Where do our laws come from? And of course, our supreme law is the Constitution, and that's supreme at the federal level, but states themselves have constitutions. Montana certainly does, and I believe all other states have their own state constitutions, which sets forth different rights and different responsibilities maybe of those states. Okay? And also, and maybe this is a little bit unusual for the U.S. It's certainly not something that other people enjoy to the extent, I guess we would say enjoy to the extent, but limitations on power too. Our Constitution famously puts limits on the power of government at all levels, and few places in the world really have limitations on government, and so we're a little bit unique in that sense. There are other nations that do have those limitations, that do have similar limitations, but those nations that have those limitations are somewhat unique. Legislation, Congress, state legislatures, local ordinances or codes, they can be called. Okay? Administrative. We'll spend a whole chapter talking about administrative law. I think EPA, right, Environmental Protection Agency, or think OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, or EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity, or I could go on and on. Okay, and they make a lot of rules that are said to have the same effect as law. And then judicial decisions or case law that basically become law. And let me give you some examples. They're ones that you've heard of. There's probably lots of other examples, but they're less well known. But Miranda v. Arizona. Okay, you maybe haven't heard so much of that decision, but certainly you've heard of Miranda rights, and that's where it comes from. Okay, so if you get read your rights, by a law enforcement person, it comes from that particular decision, which was case law. So it was not a law that was written by a legislature. It just came out of case law where, a judge at some place, and it was upheld throughout the system, said that, anybody that's arrested ought to have, or at least for certain crimes anyhow, ought to be provided with the rights. They have a right to know what they can and can't do, and it's up to law enforcement to provide those. Okay, and so Roe v. Wade would be another one that basically allowed abortions. Okay. So legislation provides some uniformity, right? Federal law preempts state law. And we have some battles back and forth, though, because those rights, according to the 10th Amendment, those rights not specifically given to the federal government should be reserved to the states and their localities. Okay, and so that's a constant source of argument between Fed and states and where the power should reside, right? States can adopt a single law throughout, and an example of that is the Uniform Commercial Code. So states have gotten together and said that in order to enhance commerce and the transportation of goods and services, right, from one state to another, and make these things possible, we'll pass this Uniform Commercial Code. Extremely valuable, and again, it's something that for the normal person you don't know about it or don't care about it, but it's really what makes it possible for you to go to Washington and buy a vehicle and bring it back here to the state of Montana. When the colonies were first formed, there were some restrictions, and they had import quotas, and they had different things like that maybe were detriments to commerce. The federal government did step in some places, but to allow that commerce to occur. But the states even said, we can go a little bit further, and so they passed these that really do allow for things like that to happen, and to honor other states and what they've done. Interpretation, right? Generally, the language is general. Again, it's general, equally applicable, all those things, right? In other words, it applies to everybody. Courts interpret. Again, courts have wide review powers. Literally, the Supreme Court could review any law made in practicality, for those reviews to happen, cases start at lower levels and work their way through the system. And that's how we like it. That's how our Supreme Court has said they like it, because that allows for an exposure of the law and its pluses and minuses, or its applicability or adherence to our Constitution, let's say. So case law or judicial law, right? Or common law, I guess we would say. One thing, there's stare decisis, which is an adherence to precedents. Okay, judges follow precedents, and if you've ever been in a court case, and I was in the banking world pretty often, but if you're in a court case and you're defending your side, your attorney and their legal staff are going to be looking for prior cases that were similar. Okay, and they'll bring those to the attention of the judge and say, here's why you ought to side with us, because look at this, or bring it to a jury and say, here's a prior precedent. We think that's a ruling, okay, that was made by a prior judge, and we think that's applicable to our case. Okay. The other side's going to be doing the same thing, and at least in some of the cases that I recall that our bank was involved in, it'd be extensive. I mean, both sides might have examples of 6 or 7, prior cases that were similar, probably not identical, but similar to the case at hand, and they argued those things, and the poor judge has to try to decide those, right? Disadvantages, there's gazillions of cases out there. Obviously, it's become a little easier to research those with the internet and whatnot. Before it was all books, and that's why lawyers used to have extensive libraries, because those libraries were full of the books and prior decisions and whatnot. There can be conflicting precedents from different jurisdictions. Maybe one jurisdiction in Montana gave one ruling, and a jurisdiction in Washington gave another one, or different parts of the state, right? Or different states of the union, and when we're dealing with federal law and those types of things. And so it becomes, there can be conflicts there. Those oftentimes move up to the Supreme Court then for a final adjudication. And conflicts of law, again, different jurisdictions or different states, different legal entities can have different laws, and there are going to obviously be conflicts in there. So how do you reconcile those through a judicial system? So legal sanctions, obviously, encourage or force compliance. They can deal with punishment and prevention. Yeah, you guys can kind of read those. They're fairly obvious, I guess you might say. So criminal conduct, what do we do with crime, right? It's a public wrong, okay? And a lot of the crimes are pretty minor. Again, it's disorderly conduct, or speeding, or running a stop sign, or open container law, those types of things, and the punishment hopefully corresponds with those, right? The court punishes on behalf of society, and the types of punishment that we have in many jurisdictions, death, right? The capital punishment is still available. It is in Montana, although it's been a long time, I think, since we've actually executed a criminal. Imprisonment, fine, removal from office, removal from maybe the bar association as a lawyer, or take away a doctor's license, those types of things, and disqualify people or businesses maybe from engaging then in certain practices or certain businesses. So we get into contract, and we got a whole chapter again later talking about breach of contract, but it's important to note, that if you've breached a contract, you may, or if somebody's breached a contract with you, you may be entitled to compensatory damages, right, that are consequential. If they're minor, may get thrown out. In other words, there has to be some harm, right? Okay. Rescission is just an ability to rescind a contract. Oftentimes it's spelled out within the contract itself. And specific performance can be an enforcement procedure that a judge may or a court may require. So if somebody was supposed to turn over to you their 20 shares of stock in XYZ company and they just haven't done it, okay, specific performance just might require them to do that. Okay, we'll get into more details of that. I was going to give you some examples, but I'll save those for when we actually talk about that. Same thing with tort. We've got a whole chapter, I believe, dealing with tort. Tort's a civil wrong other than a breach of contract. It can be intentional, negligent, or strict liability. I will give you some, an intentional tort is if you hit somebody, right? Technically, you've committed a tort. It's a criminal act, so we've got two things going on here. It's a civil wrong, but it's also it can be a criminal wrong. So it can be both, right? So you could be sued for that. Okay. Think of an intentional tort is obviously going out of your way to do something, and negligent torts are by far the more common. And the most common one that we'll see in the U.S. is going to be like traffic accidents, right? You run a stop sign, you run into somebody. You've committed a negligent tort. Now, you might get a ticket there again. You might still get a ticket for running the stop sign, but you didn't intentionally do it to hit somebody, probably. It wasn't intentional anyhow. So it can be both a civil and a criminal wrongdoing, right? Strict liability is holding people or businesses accountable for certain things. An example of that is the railroad has an obligation to fence off their right-of-ways. In some places, they've determined that it's just cheaper not to, and so sometimes a cow wanders up onto the tracks and gets hit by a train. The railroad's going to be held strictly liable for that. Okay, they're going to write a check and they're going to buy that guy's cow from him. Violations, right, of statutes or regulations can be a fine or imprisonment. Injunctions, or an injunction comes from a court and it prevents somebody from doing something maybe. There can be lawsuits for triple damages. You'll see that. The seizure and forfeiture of property, this one's creating some angst, and the Trump administration just adopted a similar policy to what the Obama administration had, and some of this is a little bit controversial. And why I say that is that they've done this in an effort to try to curb a lot of drug crimes and those types of things, and they've allowed then law enforcement agencies to actually confiscate or seize property, and property can oftentimes mean money. So they'll put they'll seize money that's in somebody's bank account or a company's bank account if they suspect that company is maybe dealing in drugs. Just as one example, it could be other things. And there have been a number of cases where it turned out that the people were completely innocent, or the business was completely innocent, and yet had a difficult, or if not impossible, time getting their property back. Or they got their property back, but it was so many years down the line that it did them no good. They had to shut down their business, file bankruptcy, do different things like that. And so this has really caused some controversy, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, more as we go along. But statutory law comes into existence through, in this case, legislatures, right? Would you enter into a business deal if you knew that it may not be adequately enforced? Probably not. Legal system and corporate governance. So a corporation is actually a legal person. The Citizens United decision, we'll talk about that later, really made that, held that to be true, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Ownership of corporations is through the shareholders, right? We can buy a lot of publicly traded corporations, for example. Any one of us could own shares of Apple, right? Resource control is through a board of directors and managers. Corporate governance is rules that protect owners' property interests. And so by property, our shares are our portion of our interest in those particular companies. And this gets a lot of debate, too, in today's day and age. So there you have it, the end of Chapter 1.